My name is Emilia Santiago. I'm 28, and last year, my beloved grandfather left me an inheritance worth over $1 million. My mother, who abandoned me as a child for parties and men, suddenly wanted back in my life, or rather, in my bank account. When I refused to fund her gambling addiction, she invited me to a family dinner. Instead, I walked into an ambush with lawyers ready to force me to sign everything over. But when they handed me those papers, I just smiled and said something that changed everything. The city of Milwaukee, where I was born, is etched into the deepest parts of my memory, not by its skyline or bustling breweries, but by the quiet comfort of a single street in a modest, tree-lined suburb. After my parents' marriage dissolved in a bitter storm when I was 8, my mother, Serena, chose the fleeting sparkle of nightlife and a rotating cast of boyfriends over the steady rhythm of motherhood. My father, in his own act of disappearance, moved to the East Coast, his presence in my life shrinking to a tinny voice on the phone a few times a year. It was my grandfather, Arthur Santiago, who became my harbor. Grandpa Art was a man carved from the same sturdy oak he used in his workshop. He'd built a renowned custom cabinetry business, Santiago and Sons Fine Woodworking, from a dusty garage and a handful of tools. He had no formal education past high school, but he possessed a deep, intuitive understanding of both wood and people. After the divorce, he persuaded my mother that I should stay with him, just for a little while, a temporary measure that, to my immense relief, became the foundation of my entire childhood. Our simple 3-bedroom house, smelling perpetually of sawdust and lemon polish, was my sanctuary. My bedroom window overlooked a sprawling backyard dominated by a magnificent maple tree. When I was 9, Grandpa built a treehouse nestled in its branches. "Mia," he told me, his voice rough but gentle, "this is your thinking spot. When the world gets too loud, you climb up here and listen to the quiet." Some of my most cherished memories are of our fishing trips to Pine Lake. He would wake me in the pre-dawn dark, the air crisp and full of promise. We'd pile into his old pickup truck, a thermos of coffee for him and hot chocolate for me, and stop at the same small diner for buttermilk pancakes. "Fishing teaches you patience, kiddo," he'd say, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he expertly baited my hook. "And life has a way of rewarding those who know how to wait for the right moment." He was teaching me about life, about stillness, about recognizing the subtle tug on the line that signals opportunity. When I wrestled with algebra, he would sit beside me at the kitchen table for hours, his large, calloused hands surprisingly nimble with a pencil. "Numbers tell a story, Mia," he'd explain, his patience a seemingly infinite well. "You just have to learn their language." By the time I was in high school, I was spending my weekends in his office, helping with the company's books. It was there, watching columns of figures transform into a clear narrative of his business's health under his tutelage, that my love for accounting was born. Meanwhile, my mother's presence was like a flicker of lightning, bright, dramatic, and gone in an instant. She would appear around Christmas or my birthday, laden with extravagant gifts I didn't need and accompanied by a new man, but she never stayed long enough for a real conversation. She'd marvel at how I'd grown, make vague promises about spending more time together, and then vanish for another 6 or 8 months. Grandpa never spoke a bad word about her in front of me, but the tightening of his jaw when she'd cancel a promised visit spoke volumes. "Your mother loves you in her own way," he would say, staring out at the garden. "Some people are like fireworks. They're beautiful and exciting to watch, but they don't provide a steady light." I enrolled at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee right after high school, full of ambition to study business. But by my sophomore year, the financial reality set in. Even with a scholarship and a part-time job at a campus coffee shop, I was drowning in expenses. Grandpa offered to help, but his business had suffered during the economic downturn, and I couldn't bear to be another burden. I dropped out, vowing to return once I'd saved enough. I found a full-time job as a bookkeeper's assistant at a local manufacturing firm, moved into a tiny apartment with 2 roommates, and began methodically saving every spare dollar. An education doesn't have an expiration date, Grandpa assured me, seeing the disappointment in my eyes. Sometimes the path just has a few more turns than you expected. 3 years later, he encouraged me to re-enroll, this time focusing solely on accounting. At 23, I was more focused, more disciplined, and a far better student than I had been at 18. Then came the call that tilted my world on its axis. A routine checkup for what Grandpa thought was a persistent stomach bug revealed stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctor's words were gentle but final. He had months, not years. I moved back into my childhood home without a second thought. My professors were wonderfully accommodating, allowing me to shift my coursework online. Those final months were a strange and precious gift, woven with threads of deep sorrow and profound love. We sat on the porch swing in the evenings, watching the fireflies begin their nightly ballet, and had conversations that had waited a lifetime to be spoken. We talked about life and death, regrets and accomplishments. "I've had a good run," he told me one evening, his hand resting on mine. "I built something from nothing. I loved your grandmother with everything I had, and I had the privilege of raising you. That's more than a man can ask for." As he grew weaker, our roles reversed. I became the caregiver, managing his medications, preparing his meals, and reading to him when his eyes grew too tired. During a moment of startling lucidity, he gripped my hand with a strength that surprised me. "Amelia," he said, using my full name as he always did when something was truly important. "I'm leaving everything to you. Not as a payment for taking care of me, though God knows I'm grateful. It's because you'll honor what I built. You understand its value. Promise me you won't let your mother squander it on her schemes." "I promise, Grandpa," I whispered through a veil of tears, the thought of any inheritance completely eclipsed by the looming loss of the only true parent I had ever known. He passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 months later. I had been reading his favorite, The Old Man and the Sea, and had dozed off in the armchair beside his bed, my hand still holding his. The funeral was a surreal blur of solemn faces, many from the woodworking and construction communities, all there to pay their respects to a man universally known for his integrity. My mother arrived late, dressed in a stylish black dress that seemed better suited for a cocktail party. She gave me a brief, perfumed hug before whispering, "When is the will reading?" Mr. Elias Vance, my grandfather's lawyer and friend for over 30 years, conducted the reading in his office the following week. My mother sat beside me, impatiently tapping her foot and checking her phone. When Mr. Vance, a kind man whose silver hair and calm demeanor radiated authority, announced that Grandpa had left his entire estate to me, save for a one-time bequest of $25,000 to her, my mother's sharp gasp cut through the quiet room. "That's impossible," she insisted, her face flushing with anger. "Arthur wouldn't do that to me. I'm his daughter." Mr. Vance simply adjusted his spectacles and continued reading. The estate included approximately $750,000 in investments, the family home valued at around $400,000, and his workshop, filled with valuable tools and rare lumber, worth at least $50,000. There were also the personal items of immense sentimental value, his collection of antique hand planes, his fishing gear, and the meticulously kept photo albums. My mother stormed out of the office before Mr. Vance had even finished, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind her. He then passed me a sealed envelope. "Arthur wanted you to have this," he said gently. That night, alone in the quiet house that was now mine, I opened it. In his familiar, slightly shaky script, he explained his decision. He detailed decades of lending money to my mother that was never repaid, bailing her out of gambling debts, and discovering she had even sold family heirlooms to fund her lifestyle. The letter ended with words that became my anchor. "You were not just my granddaughter, Amelia. You were the daughter of my heart. Trust your own judgment." I always have. I was 27, had just finished my accounting degree, and was working an entry-level job. The inheritance wasn't a lottery ticket. It was security, opportunity, and a profound responsibility to honor the legacy of the man who had given me everything. 3 days after the funeral, the first call came from my mother. She had urgent medical bills. When I gently pressed for details, the story shifted to needing a new car. I offered to help her find a reliable, affordable vehicle. She hung up on me. It was only the beginning. The autumn air outside had a crisp bite that mirrored the growing chill in my heart. My mother's first unannounced visit came 3 weeks after Grandpa's funeral. I was in his home office, sorting through decades of business files, when the doorbell began to ring insistently, followed by a loud, rattling knock. "Amelia, open this door. It's an emergency." Serena's voice was high-pitched with a manufactured panic that still, after all these years, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I rushed to the door, my mind racing through a list of possible calamities, only to find her looking perfectly healthy, if a bit frantic. She pushed past me into the living room, her eyes sweeping over the familiar space with a new, proprietary air. "Thank God you're home," she said, dropping her designer handbag onto Grandpa's favorite armchair. "I need your help. It's urgent." The emergency was a consultation she'd had for a mommy makeover, a combination of cosmetic procedures her latest boyfriend, a slick consultant named Leo, had supposedly promised to pay for before encountering a sudden cash flow problem. She spread glossy brochures from a high-end clinic across the coffee table, her voice animated as she described recovery times and potential results. "It's an investment in my future, really," she concluded, looking at me expectantly. "Mom," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "I'm not paying for your plastic surgery." Her expression curdled, shifting from excitement to wounded indignation in a heartbeat. "I'm not asking for a handout, Amelia. I'm asking for a small loan. From the money that should have been half mine to begin with. I am his only child. I'm willing to help with real needs," I offered, trying to keep my voice steady. "If you have actual medical bills, or if you need help with your rent, we can talk about that." That's when the performance began. She paced the worn Persian rug, her voice rising as she recounted her supposed sacrifices as a young mother, the unfairness of her life, and my shocking selfishness. When the guilt trip failed, she pivoted to threats. She'd contest the will, she declared. Grandpa was sick, on heavy medication, and clearly not of sound mind. Any judge would see he was being manipulated, she spat. I didn't mention the video Mr. Vance had wisely recorded 6 months before the diagnosis, where a perfectly healthy grandpa Art calmly and clearly articulated his wishes and his reasons. She left that day empty-handed, but the war had been declared. Within a week, the phone calls started. My Aunt Diane, my mother's older sister, called to see how I was doing, then casually steered the conversation toward how much easier it would be for everyone if I just gave Serena what she wanted to keep the peace. Uncle David followed a few days later, his discomfort palpable through the phone line as he mumbled similar sentiments. Then came the texts from Leo, her boyfriend. He had a way of phrasing threats as friendly advice. "Your mom is really hurting, Mia. A family is supposed to support each other. It would be a real shame if this whole thing had to get ugly." Over the next month, I began to understand the true depth of my mother's desperation. I discovered she was facing eviction, had maxed out several credit cards in her name, and, most disturbingly, owed a significant sum to what Leo vaguely referred to as his business associates. The situation escalated dramatically when my credit card company called to flag a suspicious application. Someone had tried to open a new, high-limit card in my name, using my social security number and date of birth. The only reason it was caught was because the application listed my mother's address. When I confronted her on the phone, she dissolved into a torrent of practiced tears, blaming desperate times and swearing it would never happen again. I wanted to believe her, the little girl in me still clinging to a sliver of hope, but I filed fraud alerts with all 3 credit bureaus that same afternoon. 2 weeks later, she brought the war to my doorstep. I was in a client meeting at my firm when the receptionist, buzzed my office. My mother was in the lobby, she said, and she was causing a scene. By the time I excused myself and got there, Serena was loudly telling anyone within earshot about her cruel, wealthy daughter who was hoarding the family fortune while she faced destitution. My boss, Sarah, was kind but firm after security escorted a screaming Serena from the building. "Amelia, your personal life is your own," she said, her expression a mixture of sympathy and concern. "But we can't have this kind of disruption here." The shame burned hotter than any anger. I had worked so hard to build a professional reputation, and my mother had tried to tear it down in 10 minutes. The final offensive was social. She began messaging my friends and distant relatives, weaving a tapestry of lies about my fragile mental state after Grandpa's death, my irrational behavior, and her deep concern for my well-being. It was a transparent attempt to discredit me, to poison the well before I could share my side of the story. Most of my close friends saw through it, but the constant need to defend myself was emotionally exhausting. I began to retreat, screening my calls and avoiding social gatherings where I might face a prying question or, worse, an ambush by my mother. My cousin Chloe, who had always been more of a sister to me, called with a warning. "Mia, Aunt Serena is talking to Uncle David about getting a lawyer. She's really serious about trying to break the will." So, when my mother's text arrived a few days later, my guard was already up. "Hi honey," it read. "I think we've both said and done things we regret. I'd love to have a family dinner at Diane's house, to just talk and make peace. She's making her lasagna. Just us, I promise." A tiny, hopeful part of me, the part that still ached for a mother's love, wanted to believe it was genuine. But the rest of me, the part that had been trained by years of disappointment, screamed that it was a trap. I agonized for 2 days before deciding to go. But I went prepared. I slipped a small digital recorder into my purse, texted Chloe the address and time with a request to call the police if she didn't hear from me by 9 p.m., and drove to my aunt's suburban home with a cold knot of dread in my stomach. As I turned onto her familiar, tree-lined street, the number of cars parked out front sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. This was not just us. My mother's flashy red convertible was parked behind Uncle David's SUV, and next to them were 2 unfamiliar luxury sedans, a black Mercedes and a gray Lexus that screamed lawyer. I sat in my car for a full 5 minutes, my hand hovering over the ignition, every instinct telling me to drive away. But then I heard Grandpa's voice in my mind, as clear as if he were sitting beside me. "Running from trouble only gives it a head start, kiddo." Taking a deep, fortifying breath, I got out of the car and walked toward the front door. The moment I stepped inside Aunt Diane's house, the low hum of conversation in the living room ceased. It felt as though a switch had been flipped, plunging the atmosphere into a thick, expectant silence. 6 pairs of eyes swiveled to face me. The comforting aroma of my aunt's famous lasagna, a scent tied to every happy holiday of my childhood, did nothing to cut through the tension. My mother rose from the sofa, a vision of composure in a silk blouse I'd never seen. Her smile was a perfect, bright curve that didn't come close to touching her eyes. "Amelia, you made it." We were getting worried. My gaze swept the room in a quick, defensive inventory. There was my mother, the architect of this evening. Aunt Diane, hovering nervously near the dining room archway, wringing her hands. Uncle David, standing stiffly by the fireplace, avoiding my eyes. Leo, my mother's boyfriend, leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed, a smug look on his face. And seated on the love seat were the 2 strangers from the luxury cars, a man and a woman, both in their 50s, dressed in impeccably tailored suits. "Sorry I'm late," I said, my voice betraying none of the turmoil I felt. The traffic on I-94 was a nightmare. Aunt Diane scurried forward and enveloped me in a hug that was a little too tight, her familiar vanilla perfume laced with anxiety. "I'm so glad you came," she whispered, and I couldn't tell if it was a plea or a warning. "Amelia, I'd like you to meet some friends," my mother said, her tone smooth as polished granite. She gestured toward the strangers. This is Mr. Davies and Ms. Thorne. They're legal consultants who have been helping me with some estate planning. Mr. Davies stood and offered me a hand that was soft and cool. A pleasure to meet you, Amelia. Your mother has told us so much about you. I highly doubted it was anything good. Miss Thorne offered only a curt nod, her eyes giving me a cool, professional appraisal. Dinner's on the table, Aunt Diane announced with a desperate cheerfulness. Let's all sit down before the lasagna gets cold. The dining table was set with her best china, the plates with the delicate gold trim reserved for Thanksgiving and Christmas. Another red flag. I was maneuvered into a seat between Uncle David and Mr. Davies, placing me directly across from the united front of my mother, Leo, and Miss Thorne. The dinner conversation was excruciatingly banal. The weather, the Green Bay Packers' latest game, a new restaurant downtown. It was the careful, meaningless chatter of people trapped in an elevator, all of it a preamble to the real event. As Aunt Diane began clearing the dessert plates, my mother placed her fork down with a delicate click. Well, she said, her voice taking on a new, businesslike tone. I suppose we should get to the reason we're all here. As if on cue, Mr. Davies opened a sleek leather briefcase and extracted a thick sheaf of documents. Amelia, he began, his voice exuding a practiced sympathy. Your mother, and indeed the entire family, has some concerns about the disposition of your grandfather's estate. Concerns is putting it mildly, my mother added with a short, humorless laugh. We've taken the liberty of preparing some paperwork, Miss Thorne continued, her voice crisp and efficient, that we believe establishes a more equitable arrangement for everyone. Mr. Davies slid the stack of papers across the polished wood table toward me. It's quite simple, really. These documents create a family trust to manage the assets your grandfather left. Your mother, as his only child, would act as the primary trustee, ensuring all family needs are met in a fair and orderly manner. I glanced at Uncle David, but he was staring intently into his coffee cup as if it held the secrets of the universe. Aunt Diane had not yet returned from the kitchen. It's just a formality, my mother said, an edge of impatience creeping into her voice. It's what Daddy would have wanted if he had been, well, if he'd been thinking clearly at the end. I picked up the top page, my eyes scanning the dense paragraphs of legalese. Despite the convoluted language, the purpose was brutally clear. I was to sign over complete control of the house, the investments, the business assets, everything, to a trust managed by my mother. There was a vague clause about my own reasonable needs being met, subject to the trustee's approval. It was a complete and total capitulation. Just sign it, Amelia, my mother urged, pushing a heavy, gold-plated pen toward me. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. This is what families do for each other. I'd like to read it all first, I said, my voice barely a whisper. The mask of civility finally dropped from my mother's face. This is absurd. You are sitting on more than $1 million that belongs to this family, and you're going to quibble over paperwork? I am your mother. A mother who left her when she was 8. Uncle David muttered into his chest, so quietly I almost thought I'd imagined it. You stay out of this, David. Serena snapped, before turning her glare back to me. Sign the papers, Amelia, or I will see you in court. I will contest the will, and I will drag your grandfather's name through the mud. By the time the lawyers are done, there won't be anything left for any of us. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. The room felt like it was shrinking, the air growing thin. For a moment, the faces around the table blurred, all except my mother's, which was sharp and predatory, her eyes gleaming with a terrible, triumphant light. This was it. This was the checkmate she had been planning. And in that moment of pure panic, I heard Grandpa's voice, a quiet whisper in the storm of my thoughts. It was a quote from Maya Angelou he loved to repeat, "When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time." My mother had been showing me who she was my entire life. This ambush was just the final, undeniable proof. The panic receded, replaced by a strange, cold calm. I looked up from the documents and smiled. The reaction was immediate. Confusion flickered across every face. My mother's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What's so funny?" Before I even consider signing anything, I said, my voice suddenly clear and steady, "I really should call Mr. Vance. He specifically warned me this might happen." The name Mr. Vance landed on the table like a block of ice. My mother's face went slack, her confident posture faltering. "That won't be necessary," Mr. Davies said quickly, his professional calm wavering. "We can answer any questions you have." My smile widened. "I don't think so. You see, Mr. Vance and I had a very thorough discussion about this exact scenario. He walked me through the specific clauses my grandfather insisted on including to prevent something like this." I turned my full attention to my mother. "For instance, did you know about the interim clause? It's Latin. It means that if any beneficiary formally contests the will, their own bequest is automatically forfeited. Your $25,000 would go directly to the Children's Hospital of Wisconsin." Grandpa really did think of everything. The two lawyers exchanged a panicked glance. This was clearly not a part of their plan. That's a bluff," my mother stammered, but the conviction had drained from her voice. I slowly reached into my purse. I saw Leo tense by the wall, as if he expected me to pull out a weapon. Instead, I placed my small digital recorder on the table, its tiny red light blinking steadily. "I've been recording this entire conversation since I walked in the door," I said conversationally. "Wisconsin is a one-party consent state, which means this is perfectly legal and, I imagine, very interesting." Leo took a half step forward. "You can't do that." "Oh, I can," I continued, unlocking my phone. "I also have records of every harassing phone call, a log of your visit to my office, and the very helpful text messages you sent me, Leo, which my lawyer seems to think border on extortion. He's already drafted the paperwork for a restraining order." I scrolled through my phone nonchalantly. "Speaking of my lawyer, I'm supposed to check in with him by 9 p.m. That gives us about 10 minutes. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from a siege to a rout. Mr. Davies snapped his briefcase shut. "Ms. Santiago, I believe there has been a significant misunderstanding here." "Has there?" I asked. From my purse, I produced a folded copy of the will. "Because this seems crystal clear to me." I unfolded it and read from a passage I had long since committed to memory. "I leave the whole of my estate, including all real and personal property, to my granddaughter, Amelia N. Santiago, who has been the singular joy of my life and whose integrity and judgment I trust without reservation. I make this decision in full awareness of the expectations of my daughter, Serena, which I have chosen not to meet due to a long and documented history of financial irresponsibility and a consistent disregard for the well-being of our family." I looked up at my mother's ashen face. "There's more. A lot more. Including a detailed letter filed with the probate court outlining decades of your behavior." My mother looked as if I had slapped her. "He had no right to air our private business." "He had every right," I said softly. "Just as I have every right to honor his final wishes. Wishes he made to protect his legacy from the very thing you are trying to do tonight." I gathered my purse and my phone and stood up. "I'm leaving. And this is what is going to happen now. You will all leave me alone. No more calls. No more surprise visits. No more ambushes. If I hear from any of you again, except through a lawyer, I will proceed with the restraining order and explore every other legal option Mr. Vance has outlined for me." I looked directly at the two lawyers. "And I would advise you both to choose your clients more carefully in the future. Attempting to coerce a beneficiary under duress could have significant consequences for your licenses." My mother shot to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "You ungrateful little—" "Serena, stop it." It was Aunt Diane, her voice sharp and clear as she finally emerged from the kitchen, her face streaked with tears. "Just stop. She's right. This was wrong." "You knew about this," my mother shrieked, turning on her sister. "I let it happen," Diane admitted, her voice trembling but firm. "Because you swore it was just a family talk." Not this. Uncle David pushed himself away from the fireplace, his shoulders squared. I told you this was a bad idea, Serena. Dad knew what he was doing. He always did. My mother looked around the room, her empire crumbling around her. Her gaze fell on Leo, who was already inching toward the door, his expression one of pure self-preservation. Her last ally had abandoned the field. This isn't over, she hissed, but the threat was an empty echo. I walked to the front door and paused, my hand on the knob. I looked back at her, the woman who gave me life but never a home. It is over, Mom. Grandpa made his choice. I would have helped you, I truly would have, if you had just been honest with me. But you didn't want help. You wanted it all. And now you'll get nothing more from me. I stepped out into the cool night air, each breath a fresh wave of freedom. The weight of the last few months, a crushing burden of anxiety and fear, began to lift from my shoulders. I made it to my car, got in, and turned the key. And then, once I was a few blocks away, safely anonymous under the glow of the streetlights, the dam broke. I pulled into a deserted grocery store parking lot and wept for my grandfather, for the mother I never had, for the ugly, painful severing of a tie that had been broken long ago. I cried until I was empty, and then I called my best friend, Olivia. I'm on my way, she said, her voice a balm of unwavering support. Wine or ice cream? Both, I managed, a watery laugh catching in my throat. Definitely both. 6 months after that night, I stood in the living room of my new condominium, watching the morning sun spill across the polished hardwood floors. The space was bright, modern and anonymous, a fortress of solitude my mother couldn't breach. Selling Grandpa's house had been a painful but necessary amputation. The memories were part of me. The building itself had become a liability. I'd sold it to a young family, a contractor and his pregnant wife, who promised to cherish its solid bones. The proceeds, combined with a portion of the inheritance, had allowed me to start over. I established Santiago Financial Services, an accounting firm dedicated to helping small businesses and tradespeople, people like my grandfather. His old oak desk was the centerpiece of my home office, a silent, steadying presence. I'd also created the Arthur Santiago Skilled Trades Scholarship at the local community college. The legal battle had fizzled out after the ambush. Mr. Davies and Ms. Thorne had formally withdrawn as my mother's counsel, and the restraining order, which I did file against her and Leo, had been granted without contest. The ensuing silence from her was both a relief and a sorrow. The public shaming on social media had died down, thanks in large part to Aunt Diane and Uncle David, who, in a surprising display of late-blooming integrity, had set the record straight with the rest of the family. My life began to fill with new things. A cautious but growing relationship with a kind landscape architect named Daniel. A renewed connection with my father, who, upon hearing of the inheritance drama, had called to apologize for his decades of absence, explaining the history of my mother's manipulations that had driven him away. A deeper, more honest friendship with my aunt and uncle. My chosen family, Olivia, Daniel, my cousins, had closed ranks around me, creating a bulwark of love and support. Then, one day, a letter arrived, postmarked from Arizona. The handwriting was my mother's. I left it on the kitchen counter for 3 days before I found the courage to open it. It was from a rehabilitation center. She had hit bottom, she wrote. The $25,000 had vanished in a week, followed by a series of desperate acts that had finally led her to seek help for her gambling addiction. I don't expect you to forgive me, she wrote. I know I don't deserve it. I just want you to know that I am sorry. For everything. It wasn't a solution, but it was a beginning. I wrote back a short, simple note, wishing her well in her recovery, a small gesture of peace across a vast distance. There would be no miraculous reunion, no tearful reconciliation that erased the past. But perhaps, over time, something new and honest, built on a foundation of hard-won boundaries, could grow. On the first anniversary of Grandpa's death, I visited his grave. As I was leaving, the cemetery groundskeeper, an old man with kind eyes, stopped me. "Are you Amelia Santiago?" he asked. He handed me a dusty, shoebox-sized package. "A man left this with us years ago. Said to give it to his granddaughter Amelia if she ever came to visit his plot after he was gone. Said he knew you would." Inside was Grandpa's personal journal from the year after my grandmother died. Page after page chronicled his profound grief, his struggle, and his slow return to life, all centered around the unexpected arrival of an 8-year-old girl who needed him. The final entry, written in his strong, clear hand, read, "Serena dropped Mia off today, and I haven't heard from her in a week." Looking at this little girl, with her serious eyes and quiet ways, I realized my Eleanor sent her to me. She came to save me, not the other way around. The business, the house, the money in the bank, none of it matters. This little girl is my real legacy, the only one that counts. Tears streamed down my face as I clutched the journal to my chest, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of gratitude, of understanding. The inheritance had never been about the money. It was his final act of love, a tool he was entrusting to me to build a life of my own, free from the chaos that had defined my mother's. He had given me the resources, but the real inheritance was the strength he had nurtured in me all along, the strength to stand my ground, to trust my own judgment, and to protect the legacy of a good man. And in doing so, I had finally, truly, come home to myself.